we go. We're in the book of Judges today, and remember I warned you before we read it that it had some really kind of crazy stories in it, so beware, right? Very interesting chapter in Israel's history. But I think we have some profound lessons that we'll learn from it this morning. So let's just review really quick what we've learned so far. The first era was creation, right? Creation, fall, flood, towers. Second era was the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Third era that we spent many weeks on was the Exodus, the deliverance, the law, the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, and 40 years of wandering. The fourth, we just learned last week, so let's review that together. What was the fourth era? No, before Judges. Conquest, right? And do you remember the four main things of the conquest? 2 miracles, the parting of the Jordan River, and then Jericho, and then the conquest, and then dominion. And that was probably, in terms of time-wise, that was the shortest, because it was about 7 years that they figure it took them to conquer the land, once they entered the land. And now we're into a longer period of history, but it's only one book in the Bible, and that fifth era is called what we're on today, Judges, right? And the 4 main things for Judges, the first one is judges. But who were these judges? When we picture a judge, what do we picture? In the courtroom with a black robe, making decisions. Is that what these judges were? No. How did it describe them in 30 days? They're more political, military leaders of the people, but they're called judges. The second important thing about this era of the judges is it's characterized by rebellion, right? God had given them their law. Before he took them into the land, he explained to them, right, that what kind of a covenant did he make with them? A conditional covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. And he said, if you will follow my instructions and do what I'm asking you, I will bless you like no other nation has been blessed. But if you don't drive all these people out, if you don't get rid of their idols, if you start intermarrying with them, and you don't follow my commands, then I will punish you, right? So the second covenant he made with the Israelites was a conditional Mosaic covenant. And when we get to Judges, we find out that they are really not doing well at keeping the covenant, are they? And so they enter what he identifies as cycles. And how are those cycles? I wrote it on the board, but how do those cycles go? How do they start? They sin, right? They all, they worship idols. They don't do the things that God asked them to do. And that is followed by what? Defeat, right? God uses another people group to defeat them and to put them back into captivity because of their disobedience. And then what happens?
Repent.
Then they finally cry out. They say, help us. We know we've done the wrong thing. Help us. And what does God always do in his grace? He delivers them. He actually raises up a judge, somebody to lead them into a time where he delivers them. And then after that, they experience a period of freedom and of peace. And then where do they go? Right back into sin. And we're just going to see this cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. And I think the lesson for us in here is that as individuals, this can happen as well, can't it? Right? Maybe you could testify yourself that you were in that kind of a cycle where you didn't really want to listen to the Lord or what the Lord had to tell you, and so you were living life your own way. And what happens when we live life our own way? Things fall apart and we end up having really negative consequences. And sometimes it's when those things fall apart that finally we look back up and say, Lord, I've blown it. And God in his grace so many times will rescue us. Not that we don't have consequences, but then what do we do with that? Then after his rescue, do we say, now we know, now we understand, or do we just fall right back in, now that everything's okay again, right? So we understand this cycle. We understand it on an individual level, and now we're seeing it in Israel on a national level. So let us hop in. Judges, yes.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
On the conquest, that
Yeah.
kind of thing, it started off so well.
Yes.
And they were so strong.
Yes.
And they just hit
Yes.
one after another and defeated them, killed them all, or driven them out, or because he said you just have to completely wipe them out, destroy it.
Yeah.
And then they slowed down and they stopped doing that. I was just writing this down now. Was it a combination of they started having a lack of faith, or they were scared of some of these next ones, even though they had just conquered this guy, and
Well,
they
think
came
about
together?
this. I think
Or did they get lazy, or were they just kind of like good enough? Or
probably some of it all, right? And I think we can see that, how that can happen as a people, and how that can happen as an individual.
Exactly.
You're like, okay, well now this is good enough. I don't want to keep having to fight this battle, right?
Yeah.
And now they do have lands of their own that they can occupy, that they can start, hey, instead of going to war, let's just accept what we have, right?
And then yet Joshua allowed it.
Joshua instructed them not to be content with that, but to go in and to finish the battle.
Yeah.
But we're going to see. Actually, Judges starts off where they're going to finish the battle. They're going to, at the beginning of Judges, they're like, yes, we can do this. Because it says in chapter 1, they ask of the Lord, who will be the first? Chapter 1, verse 1, who will be the first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites? And this is after the death of Joshua, right? Yeah. So Joshua's gone. And they're saying, okay, Joshua told us we got to keep fighting, we got to take the land. Who's going to go up? And the Lord answers, Judah is to go. I've given the land into their hands. So Judah, and I want you to see, now for those of you who are watching on video, I've handed out 2 maps that you can find on, oops, did I forget to bring my, I forgot, oh, here they are, I'm sorry. I handed out 2 maps that you can be looking at as we go. And one of the maps is, if you type in on Google, the 12 tribes of Israel, map of the 12 tribes of Israel, this is one of the maps that comes up. I thought it was very beautiful colors, and it gave a little more detail than some of the other maps, is why I chose this particular one. But I wanted you to see the first one that goes up is Judah. We'll just keep referring to these maps so you can get some idea of where these battles and everything takes place. And Judah along with Simeon. Now if you look at the map, you'll see Simeon is smack dab in the middle of Judah. So it makes sense that Judah and Simeon would team up to go after the Canaanites that are still in this section of the land. So they go up to fight, and they attack the Canaanites. And Adonai-Bezek, who we met back in Joshua 10 in verse 6, he's the king, and he flees, but they chase after him. And what do they do in verse 6? These are pretty, sometimes these stories are pretty horrific. They cut off his thumbs and his toes, and you're like, ooh, gross, right? But then you find out, somebody read verse 7, we find out what Adonai-Bezek used to do. Somebody read verse 7.
Adonai-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes.
And 7.
Ouch.
Mm-hmm.
Then Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. So,
how fascinating, right? I think the thing was, when you conquered a king, that you were to completely humiliate him. So what would Adonai-Bezek do? He would cut off the thumbs and the toes of the kings, and then they would have to pick up scraps at his table. How humiliating, right? So anyway, I guess even he realized he was getting what he deserved. Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
The reason why they cut off the thumbs is because they couldn't use it for battle.
Oh.
There was some strategic, and then also the toes being able to
Yeah,
It's
can't
all
run,
out.
yes, right,
Can't
Yeah.
fight anymore.
yeah, that's,
They couldn't run.
right, that makes good sense, thanks for that, LaDon. And then actually, they talk about Caleb taking Hebron and offering his daughter to the one who would take this particular place, and that's Othniel, so that's kind of a review. And then it says in verse 19 that the Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had iron chariots. So we are going to begin to see the problem here. So Judah and Simeon had success, but there were people living in the plains that they weren't able to drive off. So then somebody read verse 21. Now, I don't think any of us know the proper pronunciations for most of these places, so just guess and go for it, right? So somebody read verse 21.
Chapter.
We're in chapter 1 of Judges.
But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem, so the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day.
Okay, so here's Benjamin. It's this little yellow place in the middle here. And Jerusalem is at the very southern part of Benjamin. And they couldn't drive out the Jebusites from Jerusalem. So as of the writing of the book of Judges, the Jebusites are still living there. Okay, and then drop down, somebody read verse 27, and that's about Manasseh. And I always think it's interesting, Manasseh has all this land over here on this side of the Jordan and all this land over here. So I don't know how Manasseh got such a big tract of land. But anyway, somebody read verse 27.
But Manasseh did not drive out people of Bethshan or Tanakh or Dor or Ibleam or Megiddo and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land.
Okay, so Manasseh didn't drive out everybody. And then somebody pick up with verse 29. Ephraim is this green part right in the middle.
Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them.
Okay, and then we go to Zebulun, which is this like blue-green turquoise area up here. Somebody read about Zebulun in verse 30.
But Zebulun did subject them to forced labor.
Okay, but start in verse 30.
Oh, sorry. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or Nahalol, so these Canaanites live among them. But Zebulun did subject them to forced labor.
Okay, all right. So you guys are doing great just guessing at these names. I like it. Okay, and then verse 31 is about Asher, and Asher is this salmon-colored one up in the north. Somebody read about Asher in verse 31.
Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or Allah or of Zid or Helba or of Aphek or of Rahab. So the
For
Asherites,
you.
so the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land.
All right.
But they did not drive them out.
Yes, good job. Boy, that was a lot of long names. And then 33 is about Naphtali. Naphtali is this yellow area up in the north. Somebody read about Naphtali in verse 33.
Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh or Beth Anath, but the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, and those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced laborers for them.
Okay, so you're beginning to see, and Dan couldn't drive out the Amorites. So it's just all over the place, right? Even though they have taken this territory and they've divided it up among the 12 tribes, there's a problem. And the problem is that almost everywhere in the land, there are still Canaanites that are living among the tribes of Israel. So now we get to chapter 2, and what does the Lord have to say about this? Somebody read verses 1 through 3.
And the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt and have brought you into the land which I swear to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out sides, and their God shall be a snare unto you.
All right, so he's telling them, okay, I told you I would be with you, that if you would just press forward, I would give you victory. But now, because you've decided not to, and just to be content to live in the land along with these Canaanites, I'm not going to drive them out anymore. And he said, and they're going to be a snare for you. And then we learn it kind of went back because we started out with Joshua's death, but in chapter 2, verse 6, after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites and they went to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance, it says in verse 7, the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. What are some of the great things that Joshua and the elders had seen the Lord do? The parting of the Red Sea. So they were children, but yes, there are still many alive that had seen the parting of the Red Sea.
Well, just all the plagues and
All of that. They had seen that. What else had they seen?
Manna.
Manna from heaven. They'd experienced this amazing miracle of God sending bread from heaven. When they're in the wilderness, water out of rocks. They'd watched God provide water where there was no water. What else had they seen?
The cloud and
The
pillar
cloud,
of fire.
the cloud and the pillar of fire. This miracle of God's presence that was leading them forward. What else had they seen? Jericho's. Their first. Now, they were talking about these stories from 40 years ago, and now they had their own story because they had seen God miraculously give them the people of Jericho through the walls falling down, right? They'd also seen the Jordan River part. So even though many of them hadn't been alive when the Red Sea, they had seen God part the Jordan. So it says that during the lifetime of those who had seen all these miracles, the people did pretty good at following the Lord. But afterwards, what happens? So somebody pick up with, and chapter 2 just kind of gives us an outline of the whole book, right? So let's read what he says. Somebody pick up in verse 10 and read 10 through 12.
And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel.
Okay, let's stop right there. So another generation arises who doesn't know the Lord, nor do they know what he had done for Israel. How is that possible?
They didn't share the information, it wasn't written down.
They didn't share it with what had God specifically told them to do.
Teaching to your children.
To teach all this to your children, to tell them about it when you're sitting down, when you're rising up, when you're walking on the way, wherever you are. Talk to your children about these things.
But I see us talking to our children, but our children are not accepting it. And they're
Well,
turning and doing their own thing.
And that's true, and that would be one thing if they said their children heard and they rejected it. But what does it say? It says, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So whose fault is that? That's the fault of the parents. The parents who knew, not teaching their children. So you're right. It's not that if parents teach their children will always follow. But in this particular case, God is saying they didn't know. And they didn't know. There's only one way they couldn't know. They couldn't know if their parents weren't faithfully passing on the truth to their children and to their grandchildren. So keep going, Candace. Verse 11 and 12.
Okay. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger.
Okay, so they didn't learn and know about the Lord, and so they began to follow the gods of the people in the land. And then in verse 14, so then the Lord, in his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. And we're going to see this happens again and again. And then if they get in great distress, this doesn't identify the fact that they cry out, but in most every cycle, the people finally get to a point where they say, Lord, help! We realize that we've done wrong. And then in verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of the raiders. So this is like an outline description of what we're going to read happen again and again in the book of Judges. And then in verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, what happened? The people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. So in verse 20, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me. What covenant is he referring to? The Mosaic Covenant. I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. So in chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served other gods. How sad is that? The very exact things that God had said, be careful, don't forget, remember, this is my instruction to you. You need to destroy them completely, you need to not intermarry with them, and you need to absolutely not follow after their gods. And here they are doing all those things. So we learned about the first judge. The first judge was named Othniel, and Othniel is Caleb's nephew, son-in-law, right? And so Othniel reigns for a period. We don't find out much about him, but he reigns for a period of 40 years. There's peace in land in verse 11 of chapter 3. And then, once again, verse 12, what did the Israelites do? They did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord gave Eglon, how's that for an evil name? Eglon, the king of Moab, power over Israel. So, if you look at your map here, Moab is down here at the bottom of the Dead Sea. So this is where Moab is, and so Eglon is down here, but he's taking, we find out, he's kind of taken this whole area in where he is making them pay tribute. So this is how they would do it. The Israelites would raise all the crops, and then he would come in and he would take a good portion of them, right? The Israelites were subject, it says in verse 14, they were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. And then, finally, again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, verse 15. And then he gave them a deliverer, Ehud. Now, I love all the detail in this story, right? So Ehud is what-handed? He's left-handed. And he comes up with this idea. What's he going to do? He's going to go to Eglon to present his tribute. And he goes with a bunch of men. After they present the tribute, he comes back out and he tells the men to go ahead. Now, why do you suppose he told the men to go ahead? I think he knew what he was doing was risky. I think he told the men to go ahead because he didn't want, if it didn't go well, he didn't want anybody else to get in trouble. But what had he done when he goes back to see Eglon? What had he done? He strapped a 1.5-foot sword onto his thigh, on his right thigh. And then he put his cloak on over him. And then he goes to Eglon and he tells Eglon, I have a message for you, but it's secret. So Eglon falls for this, right? And in verse 19, he says, quiet, and he makes all of his attendants leave. And then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his summer palace. And Ehud said, I have a message for you. And as the king rose, what did Ehud do? He reached with his left hand, drew out the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. And how do you like verse 22? Even the handle sank in after the blade, which came out his back. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat just closed over it. But again, all this detail is here because that's the way it happened. I'm sure he got back and he says, "You won't believe this," right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then he goes out and he locks the door to the room that he was in, and after he's gone, it just cracks me up. Verse 24. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said, "He must be relieving himself in the inner room of the house." They waited to the point of embarrassment. Isn't this hilarious? So anyway, to give us that much detail, like the reason Ehud got away is because his servants assumed he was going to the bathroom and they were too embarrassed to go in and interrupt him, right? So they wait long enough that Ehud makes his escape. And so then Ehud, calls everybody, he blows a trumpet, verse 27, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. The Israelites went down with him, and God gave them victory over Moab. And verse 30, that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. So 80 years under Ehud. And then verse 31, we meet a guy named Shamgar who struck 600 Philistines down with an ox goad, and he too saved Israel, but that's all we get on him. So just a little brief thing. And then what happened after Ehud died in chapter 4? Verse 1. What did they do? They did evil in the sight. You can basically say that for every time we get to a new one. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They went back to the old ways. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. So Hazor is up here. So before we were talking about Moab, now Hazor's way up here in the north. So in the meantime, God had raised up a woman down here in this area down here named Deborah. And she's in the hill country of Ephraim down here. And what does it tell us about Deborah? She's an interesting character in God's story. She's married, and she's a prophetess. So she is speaking to Israel on behalf of the Lord, and she is the only one that is actually acting like a judge in the way we think of judges.
And she's a warrior.
Well,
Did she go out to?
Well, I think by default, I don't think she was a warrior. I don't think she went off all these battles.
But did she fight?
She went with them. It doesn't say that she fought, but she went with them because Barak says, "I won't go without you," right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, she's down here, but their problem right now is up here in the north with this King Jabin. And so she tells Barak, who lives up here in Kadesh, and she tells Barak, "Listen, the Lord's going to give," from down here, she says, "The Lord's going to give you victory. You need to meet over here out Mount," where was it? She tells him what mountain to go to. I think it's Tabor. So anyway, she tells Barak that God's going to give you them into your hands. I'm going to lure Sisera, verse 7, the commander of Jabin's army and his chariots, to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. So Barak says, "Well, I will do this if you go with me, but if you won't, I won't go." So Deborah says, "Okay," but what does she tell him? If I go, what's going to happen? Who's the credit going to go to?
Her.
To a woman. Now she just says a woman, so it's kind of interesting that in the end, 2 women enable this victory, right? So she ends up going with him, and they fight Sisera, and they have this amazing victory against Sisera, but Sisera gets away, and again, some pretty amazing details here. In 14, Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands." So Barak goes, and at 15, at Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. So now Sisera, the commander of the army, is on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots, right? All the troops of Sisera fell by the sword, and not a man was left. But Sisera, this commander of the armies, is still on foot. He's fleeing on foot, and he goes to the tent of Jael. Now, Jael is a descendant of Moses' in-laws. If you want to go back to verse 11, Jael is a descendant of Moses' brother-in-law. And she welcomes him in because there had been a treaty between them. She welcomes him in, she gets him all situated. Somebody pick up in verse 18 and read the story down to 21.
Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died.
These stories, right? So, but pretty brave lady, right? She knew that this was the commander of the forces, and if that he got away, he would be a problem for the Israelites. So she took care of the problem. So anyway, they do a song in commemoration of this. And you have to understand that back in the old days, right, they didn't all have, there are no printing presses, they don't have books to hold all this information. So they would often do ballads and songs to remind them, right? We saw a song sung after the parting of the Red Sea, a song sung after different really key events. And so they sang this song, they made a ballad so that this happening would stay through posterity. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to say. So anyway, they wanted them to remember it, so they sang this song, and the song described who came to their aid, who didn't come to their aid, like it says in 15. In the districts of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. Why did you stay among the campfires to hear the whistling for the flocks? In the district of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. So they're telling on the different ones. They're saying who was brave in this battle and who was not brave and who didn't come to their aid. And it also says in verse 20, from the heavens, the stars fought. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. So I think they're attributing to the fact that we had supernatural help from God for this. And then it goes on to relate exactly what happened with Jael. And I always try and picture this song, right? They're singing this as a song and talking about how he asked for water and she gave him milk. And then she reached, in verse 26, her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead. I'm just like, oh, what a lovely song. So yeah, Sophie's got it. She's got the tune all worked out. So then it says the land had peace for 40 years. So Deborah rules, and for 40 years the land has peace. And then we get to chapter 6, and what happens again?
Evil.
Yes, they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord gives him over to the hand of the Midianites. Now the Midianites live way here in the south. They're not even on the map, but they're in the south here. And they start oppressing the people. It says in verse 6 of chapter 6 that Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Because in verse 4 it says they ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. So can you imagine? I mean, the Israelites are just scraping for something to eat. That's how bad it's gotten under the Midianites. So in verse 7, the Israelites cry out to the Lord because of Midian, and he sends them a prophet saying that he's going to free them. But then who does he appear to? He appears to a man named Gideon, a young man named Gideon, who lives right around, I'm trying to put these two maps together, just below Jezreel is where he lives. He's from Manasseh, so he's in the north of Manasseh here, in a place called Ophrah. And he's threshing wheat in his winepress when an angel appears to him in verse 12 and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And Gideon is, I think, pretty amazed by this. He says, "But sir," verse 13, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?'" So what does this tell you about Gideon?
He was told.
He was told. So I think it's probably like in our day and age. Like, there were a lot of people who hadn't even heard about what God had done for the Israelites, but there were still people who were faithfully telling their children. Now, this is kind of an interesting situation. So he knows about it, but he says, but now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of the Midianites. So what does he not articulate? He understands that the Lord had saved them in dramatic ways, but he doesn't seem to understand that the reason that the Midianites are enslaving them is because what? What's the cause? Their sin, and their worshiping of idols. So the Lord turns to him and says, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? And what does he say? Somebody read 15.
Oh my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house.
And I think this is just the Lord's way. I think he just loves to use the weakest and the least. Because when he uses the weakest and the least to accomplish great things for his name, who gets the credit? God, right? So Gideon's like, who am I? I'm like least in the tribe of Manasseh. Why would you choose me? And the Lord says, I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites together. So Gideon's not sure, so he says, listen, but he knows this is somebody important, so he says, let me bring you an offering. He brings him an offering, and what happens to the offering? He brings him out, he offers the offering, and somebody read verse 20 and 21.
The angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared.
Keep going with 22.
Then Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord. He exclaimed, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face.
All right. So he realizes that he was speaking to an angel of the Lord because the fire miraculously appears and burns up the offering. Anyway, then his next instruction from the Lord in verse 25 is to tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So here's an interesting thing. Gideon had heard about the God who saved them out of Egypt, probably from his dad or his grandpa or, others. And yet, what does his dad have on his property? He has an altar to Baal and Asherah. So what I want you to see here is this is something that missionaries will tell you about, but I think we see it in our society too. They call it syncretism. And what they do is they present the gospel to a people who have never heard, and almost always when a missionary goes into a place where nobody's heard the gospel, they are worshiping something. I think God made us to worship, and God made us with this innate knowledge that there's got to be something beyond ourselves. Usually they're sacrificing things like when Nate and Megan got to Barangunan, they would sacrifice a chicken before they would go out in their boats, right, for safety, right? There were places where you couldn't walk because they knew that there were evil spirits there, right? And so usually when you go in and you present the gospel and people hear what God, the God who made us, has done for us through Jesus, they'll go, oh, yay. But then what they do is they put that together with other things that they're believing, right? And so they still have these beliefs, but now they're just adding on this other belief. And it's called syncretism. And that is, I think, what happened here, is that there was still some belief in the God who brought us out of Egypt, but also, well, gosh, these guys over here who are defeating us, they worship Baal, so maybe we should worship Baal too. Like somebody last night said, they were covering all their bases, right? So it seems like there's this mishmash of beliefs. And so he says, you need to tear that down. You need to get rid of it. So he tears it down at night. I don't think he's very brave yet. So he tears it down at night, and he builds an altar to the true God. And when the people wake up in the morning, they're like, who did this? Verse 29. And when they carefully investigated, they were told Gideon, the son of Joash, did it. So the men of the town demanded of Joash, Gideon's dad, bring out your son. He must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So think about it. In the law, if you worshipped idols, what was supposed to be the consequence? Death, right? But now they want to kill him because he tore down an altar to an idol. Now this is interesting. It doesn't tell us that Gideon has said anything to his father, but I think he must have. I think his father must have found out, right? Before all these men found out. And I think Gideon explained to his father how he had seen this angel of the Lord and what the angel of the Lord had told him, because his response is interesting. Doesn't get all upset about his altar that was defiled. What does he say? Somebody read what Joash replied in verse 31.
But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar.
So that day they called Gideon Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend. And he actually keeps getting called this throughout, so don't get lost. When they refer to Jerubbaal, they're talking about Gideon. Because his dad said, listen, if Baal's truly a god, he can come defend himself. But I think this is interesting that his dad didn't say, what, you've destroyed my altar. He actually kind of stands up for Gideon in the midst of this. So now Gideon is like, okay, so God is calling me to do this. He blows a trumpet, he gathers a bunch of people. But it's like after the people come, he has doubts, right? Because think about it. I mean, he's just this ordinary guy who's just been trying to eke out a living, and then suddenly God's telling him, I want you to, take on these Midianites. Right? So he gathers these people to him. He blows a trumpet, gathers the people. But then in verse 36 of chapter 6, he says, if you will save Israel by my hand as you promised, look, I will place a wool feast on the threshing floor. So he gives, and this is, have you heard people refer to, have you laid out a fleece, to find out what God's will is? Now, this is not meant to be instructions for us, right? It was just the way God worked with Gideon. He was asking Gideon to do something really kind of that took pretty crazy faith. And so Gideon is saying, listen, if you're really asking me to do this, will you do this one thing for me so that I know for sure it's you? So he says, will you make the fleece wet and the ground around it dry? So sure enough, he wakes up the next morning and he wrings out a whole bowl full of water, comes out of the fleece, but the ground's dry. And does Gideon take that? No, he says, okay, just to make sure. This time I want you to do the opposite. Will you do that for me? Will you make the fleece dry and the ground around it wet? So God does that. So now Gideon's like, okay, I know this is God and he's going to be with me. So he calls the people together, and in chapter 7, how many people arrived? How many men come to fight with him against the Midianites?
300, wasn't it?
Well, no, it was the 32,000. If you look at verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. Wait a sec, where does it say 32,000?
It says 22,000.
22,000 and 10,000 remain. So at first he has 32,000, and God says, that's too many men, right? What is God worried about?
They'll get the credit.
That they'll get the credit. He's like, that's too many men. If that many men go up against the Midianites, they're going to think it's because of their power that they defeated it. So he tells them, he says, tell all the ones who are afraid to go home. They go home. 22,000. Like 2/3, more than 2/3, leave because they're afraid, which leaves 10,000. But the Lord looks at that and he says, there's still too many men. So he gives them this little test. Somebody asked last night, is there something about the way that they drank the water, that said something about their character? I said, no, I don't think so. I think God was just saying, I want to narrow it down. Do you have a thought?
Well, I've heard that the ones that just laughed,
Put their head and laughed.
They weren't looking, but the ones that knelt and went like this to drink, they were observant and watching while they drank.
Except it says that the people who kneeled were the ones that were sent away.
Oh.
Yeah. So that would make some sense to me, but no, it says...
Yeah, they were the ones that got sent away.
Right.
Okay.
So anyway, for whatever reason, the people who lapped like a dog end up getting assigned to be the 300 now. There's 300 men that are going to go up against the Midianites, and he sends all the rest back to their tents. And then he's very gracious again. In verse 10, he says, if you're afraid to attack, then go down to the camp. And before we get to that, where does it say how many men that they had?
300?
No. How many men the Midianites. Here it is, in verse 12. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the other eastern people had settled in the valley thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Wow. So here are these 300 men looking down in the valley at thousands upon thousands upon thousands of men with more camels carrying their supplies than they can even begin to count. So this is pretty intimidating, right? So God is very gracious. Again, he's asking Gideon. He knows he's asking Gideon to do something that will take a lot of faith. So he says, go on down into their camp, which actually that took a lot of bravery to go on down into the camp. And he hears this man had a dream. They're outside a tent, and the man explains, I had a dream in verse 13. A loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. And his friend, how his friend got this out of that, I have no idea. I think it was just the Lord speaking. His friend responded, this could be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. He has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. So, who was Gideon? I mean, who even knew about Gideon until just a short while ago? And yet here they're trembling because of that. So Gideon takes courage from that, and it doesn't tell him that God gave him these instructions, but he gives them, again, this brilliant battle plan that who would have thunk, right? He gives them, instead of, all this armor and, weaponry, he gives them a trumpet, and he gives them a torch, and he puts a jar over the torch. And he lines them up brings them up around the mountains, around this valley where all of them are camped. And he says, when I give the signal, you're to blow the trumpet, you're to break the jar. And so what is this going to look like for the people in the valley? It's going to look like they're surrounded. Somebody read something in their commentary about the fact that usually when people would fight at night, there would be like one torch per 100 people. It's not like everybody carried torches. So they would assume, seeing this ring of torches, that there were thousands of people, right? And then the trumpets, what happens when there's a valley and you're up on the mountains and you're... The echo, right? So it would have made this huge noise. It would make them think that they are surrounded. And what do? They start fighting each other. Verse 22, when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So they start killing each other, and then they flee, and the Israelites, all these northern Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh came out in verse 23. They pursued the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim. So it's all these people up here who are attacking, but now he's sending word to Ephraim. And Ephraim comes and they kill two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. And now in chapter 8, I just want to point this out because the Ephraimites, I think, are just whiners. They whine in chapter 8 and they whine in chapter 12. We're going to see. The Ephraimites ask Gideon, why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian? And they criticized him sharply. Now, if he'd been defeated by Midian, do you think they had criticized him for not calling them out? No. But anyway, they're upset, and he pacifies them, saying, well, look at you guys defeated these two kings of the Midianites. What have we done in comparison to you? So he sues them. Then as they're chasing these people, there are two towns that they ask for help, for bread and for help as they continue pursuing them. The towns say no. They said, you haven't conquered them yet, so we're not going to help you. So in the end, they go back and they punish these towns for not having helped them during this battle. So somebody pick up at chapter 8, verse 22, and read chapter 8, 22 and 23.
Not 22 verses in there.
Chapter 8, verse 22 and 23.
Oh, I was looking right.
Yeah. Somebody read chapter 20, or chapter 8, verse 22 and 23.
Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you."
All right, so I like Gideon, right?
Me too.
I mean, he's humble, right? He says, "Who am I to do this thing that you're asking?" And then he says, "I won't rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." You're like, go Gideon. But then what happens in the next verse? Keep reading, Sophie, 24.
And Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil." For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites.
So the people say, "Oh, yes, of course. I mean, that's the least we could do." They all give him gold earrings. And verse 27, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which is like a breastplate, which he placed in Ophrah, his town, and all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. And you think, oh my
After
goodness,
all
Gideon, you
that.
were doing so
Yeah.
good, right? How
Do
sad.
you think his intention, that was his intention?
I'm sure he meant it as like a memorial for what had happened, you know, but again, and I think this is why God says not to make images, right? Because people forget it's not about this thing, it's about him, right? And so that's kind of sad. And then Midian was subdued before the Israelites did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace for 40 years. And then it says he had how many sons? Verse 30. 70, because he had, yeah. And then we find out, oh dear, it's not only like he had many wives and many sons, but he also had a concubine who was down here. So he was up in the northern part of Manasseh. Shechem's down in the southern part. And it says he had a concubine down there, and this concubine gave him one son named Abimelech. Well, that ends up being a big problem. So Abimelech, after Gideon dies, Jerubbaal is the other name for Gideon. He goes to his mother's brothers in Shechem down here because Gideon's family is up here. He goes to his brothers in Shechem and he says, "Hey, listen," he says, "wouldn't you rather be under me than under all 70 of these sons of Gideon?" He said, "And I'm your brother, I'm family." So he convinces the people of Shechem to follow him. He gets a bunch of, it says, adventurers to kind of gather around him. And he goes up to the northern, to Ophrah, where Gideon was from, and he murders 69 of the 70 sons of Gideon. He just murders them all. It says, verse 5 of chapter 9, he went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone he murdered his 70 brothers. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. So one escaped. And this Jotham ends up going up. So if you look on your other map, Shechem is right here, like in the middle. And he goes to Mount Gerizim, which is just right next to, right under Shechem. So Jotham gets up on Mount Gerizim and he shouts kind of this parable. You know, the olives went out and looked for, the trees went out and looked for somebody to reign over them. They asked the olive tree, and the olive tree says, "No, I'm busy providing oil." And then they go to a fig tree, and the fig says, "No, I'm not going to be your king." And then the vine says no. So finally, verse 14, finally all the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." Verse 14. So who's the thorn bush? Who's this analogy? Abimelech is the thorn bush. And he says, "Now, if you have acted honorably," verse 19, and acted in good faith toward Jerubbaal, Gideon, and his family today, may Abimelech be your joy, and may you be his too. That's thick with sarcasm. "But if you have not," verse 20, "let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you, citizens of Shechem and Beth Milo, and let fire come out from you, citizens of Shechem and Beth Milo, and consume Abimelech." So I wanted you to see that because actually this kind of happens. So Jotham flees, right? And Abimelech, it says, was ruling here in Shechem for 3 years, and then it says that God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem. And in the midst of this unrest, a guy named Gaal, son of Ebed, verse 26, moves into Shechem with his brothers, and the citizens begin to place their confidence in him. So, and again, they're having a festival in the temple of their God in verse 27. And while they're eating and drinking, they curse. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. While they're eating and drinking, they curse Abimelech. And Gaal says, hey, listen, why don't you serve me and we'll defeat Abimelech? But the governor of the city, who was in cahoots with Abimelech, catches word of this uprising. And so he warns Abimelech. Abimelech ends up capturing them, fighting against all the people of Shechem. And you think about this. I mean, he'd been living in Shechem all this time. So he's attacking his own city. He's killing people that he knows from Shechem. And what happens is that he finally gets them all, he defeats them all, kills most of them. The ones that are left flee to the Tower of Shechem in chapter 9, verse 46. The citizens in the Tower of Shechem go to the stronghold in the temple of El Berith. Again, it's a temple of an idol here in the middle of Israel, right? So they go to this temple, and Abimelech heard that they'd assembled there. He and all his men went up, and he took an axe and cut off the branches, which he lifted to his shoulders. He orders the men to do this. Quick, do what you've seen me do. So all the men cut branches, followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire over the people inside. So all the people in the Tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. So remember how Jotham had said, may fire come out and consume the people of Shechem? That's exactly what happened. But then Abimelech, with this confidence of having defeated Shechem, goes to Thebez, which is a place next to it, and besieged it and captured it. When he storms the tower, they all go to hide in the tower again. I guess that's what they did, right? They had these strongholds, these towers, and when you were, at the end of your rope, you ran to the tower. So Abimelech goes to the tower to storm it in verse 52. But as he approached it, what happens?
A woman dropped an upper millstone on his head.
A woman from the tower. And what's his first thought?
A woman killed me.
I don't want a woman to kill me, so he tells his armor bearer, pierce me through, because I don't want it to be said that a woman killed me. So anyway, that is the end of Abimelech, and it says, verse 56, thus God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. So Abimelech dies. Shechem's destroyed. This is just like one sad story after another, isn't it? So chapter 10, we meet Tola, who's just briefly described. He leads Israel for 23 years. Then Jair in verse 3 leads Israel for 22. And then it says that, again, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord and worshipped the gods of, verse 6, they served the Baals, the Ashtaroths, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonite, and the gods of the Philistines. So they were just like worshiping every god.
Can we go back to Tola?
Yes.
I heard what his name means, worm, but if you look at further in it, it's also scarlet, and what it is a worm that finds a tree. It's a specific worm that finds a tree and attaches itself to the tree and gives, the eggs or the larvae, whatever, and the larvae, and it dies, and the larvae eats this, worm, and it puts a red spot on the tree. So that's where the word scarlet comes from. And then after 3 days, it turns white and flakes off. And I thought that was kind of cool.
Sometimes I wonder why they name their children these names, right? Like Caleb, we named our son Caleb. We didn't know at the time that Caleb meant dog. And I'm like, who names their son dog? Now, if you look at the name tag, the name plates, right? They make these fancy name plates. It says faithful, right? Why? Because dogs are faithful. But I'm like, who names their son Worm and dog? Anyway, but that is interesting.
I just thought it was really cool, because
Yeah.
it's kind of messianic,
Yeah.
the scarlet and the white is.
Interesting,
3
right?
days later.
Yeah. So then the Israelites did evil. They're worshiping all these gods, and because they are worshiping these gods, God becomes angry with them and sells them, verse 7, into the hands of the Philistines. Now the Philistines are down here in the southern part here. This is the Philistine territory. And it says that the Philistines and Amorites shattered and crushed them, and for 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan, in Gilead and the land of the Amorites. So then, verse 10, the Israelites cry out to the Lord, we've sinned against you. And so then we're introduced to a man named Jephthah. And Jephthah is, he's from Gilead. And Gilead is over on this side of the Jordan. So Jephthah is a Gileadite, and he's a mighty warrior, but he is the son of a prostitute. And so Gilead's wife's children had kind of sent him away, sent him packing. But he was known to be a really great warrior. So when they're having all this trouble now against the Ammonites over here, when they're having this trouble against them, they call on Jephthah and they say, hey Jephthah, will you come and rescue us and help us fight them? And Jephthah says, like, why should I help you, right? Aren't you the ones that sent me away? And finally they said, Jephthah, if you will help us defeat them, we will make you our leader. And so on that understanding, Jephthah says, okay, I'll fight these Ammonites for you. So he goes to war against the Ammonites. They have this little back and forth, and I think the interesting thing about Jephthah is he really understands the history. So the king of Ammon says, I just want my land back that you took. And he says, well, wait a second. He says, we've had that land now for 300 years. Why have you waited so long? And he says, you take the land your gods give you, and you don't make any bones about it. And this is land that our God gave us. So, let it be known that our God is the one that is fighting for us in this. So anyway, they have this back and forth. And then Jephthah and his band of Israelites attack. And what does Jephthah do? It's just so sad. He does this amazing thing, but then at the same time he makes this really foolish vow. So somebody read that in chapter 11, verse 30.
If you give the Ammonites into my hand, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet you when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.
And I often think, what was he thinking? He probably wasn't thinking he's in the heat of battle, but like, what is going to come out your front door? Right? That is a horrible thought, Lori. He says he's going to sacrifice it as a burnt offering, so God gives him the victory, and he goes back, and who comes out? His only child, his daughter comes out, which makes him so sad, but she says, but you've made this promise to God, so you have to fulfill it. So the interesting thing about this is it never says he actually offers her as a burnt offering. It says that he did to her as he vowed in verse 39, and she was a virgin. There's all this thing about, she says, well, give me 2 months to go out with my girlfriends to weep because I will never marry. Well, it seems like you'd be weeping because you were going to die, right? And why do they keep bringing up the fact that she was a virgin and that she wasn't going to get married? And so a lot of commentators feel like what he did rather than offer her as a burnt offering, because that would not have been pleasing to the Lord. The Lord was very clear that that was a terrible thing to do and not to do that. So most commentaries believe that he simply told his daughter that she could never marry and never have children as a consequence of the vow he made to the Lord. We don't know that for sure, but I certainly hope he didn't sacrifice her as a burnt offering. That would have been terrible. So anyway, Jephthah rules for a period of time, and then chapter 12, the men of Ephraim call out their forces to go help Jephthah, but what do they say? They whine again. Why did you go to fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn down your house over your head. So here's Jephthah has given them this great victory, and they tell him, because you didn't call us to help you, we're going to burn down your house over your head. Anyway, there ends up being this civil war between the Ephraimites, and it's a sad day. So, and then we have three other judges really briefly mentioned. Verse 8 of chapter 12, Ibzan of Bethlehem was there for 7 years. Elon in verse 11 of Zebulun was there for 10 years, or judge for 10 years. Abdon was a judge for 8 years, and his claim to fame is he had 30 grandsons who rode 70 donkeys. I don't know what it is about donkeys, but it's kind of interesting. So 13, again, what did the Israelites do? They do evil in the eyes of the Lord, so that he gives them into the hands of the Philistines down here in the south for 40 years. And then God appears to this couple who have never had children, and he announces to them that they're going to have a son. And this son is to be a Nazirite. And we read about the Nazirite vow, that they couldn't have anything to do with grapes, they couldn't drink anything, and they couldn't cut their hair. And so the couple realizes they've seen an angel of the Lord, because again, the fire comes out and burns up the sacrifice. And so they realize that this is the Lord that has told them this. So they gave birth to a son. They named him Samson. And Samson, I love what Chuck Swindoll called him, a he-man with a she weakness. He's powerful, he's big, but oh my goodness, he makes the worst decisions when it comes to women. So we see in chapter 14 that first he wants to marry this woman who's a Philistine, right? Not an Israelite. He wants to marry this Philistine woman. His parents make arrangements, and on his way there, he kills a lion. And when they come back, what do they see in the lion carcass? Honey. So when he gets there, apparently it's tradition that for the Philistines, that the groom was to have all these companions. So they give him 30 Philistine companions, and he tells these wedding companions this riddle of about, the riddle is in verse 12 of chapter 14, or verse 14, he says, out of the eater something to eat, out of the strong something sweet. And they can't figure out the answer, so they tell Samson's wife in verse 15, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Good grief! This is just a terrible time, I think, to be alive. So anyway, Samson's wife throws herself on him, sobbing. Verse 16, you hate me, you don't really love me, you've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. So finally he breaks down and tells her the answer. She in turn explains the riddle to her people, verse 17. Then verse 18, before sunset on the seventh day, the men of the town come to him and say, what's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion? Samson said, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So in other words, you were messing with my wife, right? Somebody said last night, oh, calling your wife a heifer, that's not very good. Anyway, so he's lost the bet. The bet was that you'd have to provide 30 sets of clothing. So what does he do? He goes and kills 30 Philistines, and he brings the clothing from these 30 Philistines. And it just gets worse from there. So then after things settle down and he's not so angry, he goes back to take his wife, and what's happened? She's been given, the wife has been given to one of these companions, one of his wedding companions. And Samson is not very happy, and so in his anger now, what does he do? He ties tails of foxes together. Somebody last night was saying, my goodness, how do you do that? And he ties 300 foxes together by their tails, sets them on fire, and runs them through the fields. So, this is just terrible, right? Awful. So then they get angry, and what do? They go and they kill the wife. They they kill his wife and her family. They burned them, it says in verse 6. So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death at the end of verse 6. And then he says, well, since you've acted like this, I won't stop until I get my revenge. So he attacked them viciously, and he slaughtered many of them. And then he goes to this place, this cave in Edom. And anyway, so then they go, the people from the Philistines go to attack Judah and say, we're going to attack you unless you give us Samson. So the people of Judah go to Samson in this cave and say, hey, listen, this is your fault. So he says, well, you can give him to me, but just don't kill me. Just tie me up. So they tie him in ropes. When he gets there and the people of Judah hand him over to the Philistines, he breaks the ropes. He kills 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone. I mean, this guy had to be like Superman, right? He was that strong. And again, God was empowering him. I've heard people compare him, I don't know if I should say this, but compare Samson to Trump. And all that to say is that I have listened to this guy say, he says, when people ask me why I supported Trump, he says, I liken it to Samson. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And he says, when I teach my Sunday school class about Samson, I tell them, you would never want to imitate his example. But God used him to accomplish some things for the people of Israel. And that's what we see here in Samson. He is using Samson, as flawed as he is using Samson to accomplish something for his people. And so he doesn't learn. In 16, he goes to a prostitute down here in Gaza, again in Philistine territory.
Isn't that wrong in their society?
Of course it's wrong. All of this is wrong. He should never have been wanting to marry a Philistine to begin with, right? It's just, everything's wrong. Well, the whole book of Judges, you're just like, it's just, there's so much wrong piled on top of wrong, right? So he goes to this prostitute. The Philistines get wind of it in chapter 16, so they're going to ambush him in the morning, but he wakes up in the middle of the night. He takes the gates off the city, and he carries the gates of the city off on his back. You're like, this guy was incredibly strong. And then the famous one about Samson is in chapter 16. So after that little episode, he falls in love with a woman named Delilah. And the Philistines coach her. They say, see if you can lure him in chapter 16, verse 5, into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so that we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. So Delilah says to Samson, tell me, your secret. And at first he says, well, if you tie me up with fresh thongs, then I won't be able to get away. And then she does that. It hollers, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He snaps the thongs. And you're just like, Samson, how dumb are you, right? So then, she says, well, if you tie me with new ropes. Well, he breaks the new ropes. Well, if you weave my head in, and every time she tries it, every single time. So why in the end he tells her, you're just like, oh, so foolish. But and again, she does the same thing like his first wife had done in verse 15, when she said to him, how can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the third time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. So I guess that's the answer. He just couldn't put up with the nagging anymore. Finally, he told her that it had to do with the fact that he never shaved his head. So she says, this is real, right? The Philistines had been hiding all the while. Every time he'd done something, she told her something. And she says, come back, I know this is the truth. So sure enough, they grab him, they seize him, they gouge his eyes out, they take him down here to Gaza. But then over time, what happens? His hair grows back. And they bring him out when they're having this celebration and offering sacrifices to Dagon in chapter 16, verse 23, their god. They're having this big celebration. They bring Samson and they make him perform for them, which I think, how sad is that, right? So he's performing for them, and then he asks the attendant, he says, let me lean up against the posts, the main posts. And he goes against those main posts. He asks the Lord to give him enough strength for this last thing. And he is able to push these pillars out so that in the end he kills a bunch of Philistines as he himself dies. The interesting thing is in chapter 16, verse 31, it says, then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. I just think that's interesting. Remember, the couple was childless. And after they had Samson, apparently they were blessed with other children. So anyway, and now let's see, I don't think we're going to get to Ruth today, but let's see if we can finish this sad saga of the judges out. So it just gets from bad to worse. Now they think that up through 16, it was all kind of a chronological telling of what was going on during Judges. When we get to 17, they don't think these last two stories that they tell are chronological. It has to do with who's alive at that point. It had to be earlier on in the Judges. I think they put it at the end to just kind of show this is what it was like. Let me tell you what it was like during the time of the Judges. So what we're introduced to in chapter 17 is a man named Micah who lives in Ephraim up here in this green part in the middle of the country. And it's all just kind of anyway, from the beginning you're like, this is just messed up, right? So he has stolen 1,100 shekels from his mother, but he comes to his mother and says, listen, the 1,100 shekels that were taken from you, in which I heard you utter a curse, I have that silver with me, I took it. Now, let's say you're the mom and your son has stolen something very valuable from you and comes back and says, listen, I'm sorry, I took it. Do you say, oh, the Lord bless you, my son? Or do you say, that is a really wrong thing that you did there, right? I'm grateful that you're bringing it back. That's the right thing. But wouldn't you say something about, you know what? That was wrong. What you did was wrong. But instead she says, the Lord bless you, my son. And when he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, she said, I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a cast idol. And you're like, so I'm going to take this, dedicate it to the Lord, and make a cast image. Oh. So she takes the shekels, she makes an idol, and now Micah's like, well, I got to have a priest. So what does he do? He says he makes one of his sons a priest. Now they're Ephraimites, not Levites, but he just says, hey, I need a priest, you be my priest. But then, hey, this Levite from Bethlehem is wandering around trying to find a job, because think about it, if you were a Levite during this time of the Judges, do you think that people are giving their tithes and offerings regularly to the Lord? So how do the Levites survive during this time? If the people aren't obeying God and bringing sacrifices for the Levites and their tithes to the Levites have nothing to live on. So I'm sure that this Levite from Bethlehem is like, well, I'm not making it here in Bethlehem, so I'm going to go see if I can find someplace. So Micah, he stops at Micah's and says, I'm looking for a place to stay. And Micah says, oh, great, live with me and be my father and my priest. And I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year. So this Levite agrees to stay and be his priest and oversee the worship of this idol. Right? So then in 18, the Danites, who are over here but are still having trouble having any land of their own, they are looking for a place where they can really settle on their own. So anyway, they come through Micah's place here in Ephraim. They come through Micah's place. And for some reason, it says in verse 3 that when they were near Micah's house, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. And I think, well, how interesting is that? How did they know this young Levite from Bethlehem? But apparently they did. And they ask what he's doing there, and Micah says, the priest says, he has hired me, I am his priest. And so they ask him to inquire of the Lord, will they have success if they go up and try and find a place of their own to this country that they've seen, this town called Laish? And he says, yes, go up, you'll have success. So anyway, they decide, yes, they go back and tell their people, we found this good land, the Danites do. God's going to give us success because this priest that's worshiping this idol told us that to this Levite. So in verse 16 of chapter 18, the 600 Danites armed for battle stood at the entrance to the gate, to Micah's gate. And the 5 men who had spied out the land went inside, and they took to the carved image, the ephod, and the other household gods, and the cast idol, while the priest and the 600 armed men stood at the entrance to the gate. So as they're going back to attack this place and to live in this land, they stop at Micah's house, and they steal all of Micah's idols and his ephod and everything. So the priest is upset and says, in the end of verse 18, says, "What are you doing?" And they answer him, "Be quiet, don't say a word, come with us, be our father and priest. Isn't it better that you serve a tribe and clan in Israel as a priest rather than just one man's household?" Then the priest was glad and said, "Great! That sounds like a great idea. You go ahead and steal all Micah's stuff," who had been employing him. "Now steal his stuff and I'll go with you." So they took everything, and he's going with them. And of course, Micah realizes what's happened, and he's upset. So he goes after them. And the Danites, there's many more Danites than Micah and his friends, they said to, and verse 23, they said to Micah, "What's the matter with you that you called out your men to fight?" And he replied, "You took the gods I made, and my priests, and went away. What else do I have? How can you ask what's the matter with you?" Right? He's like, it's obvious what's the matter with me. You stole all my stuff and you took my priests. And the Danites said, "Well, don't argue with us," or they don't try and justify what they did. "Don't argue with us, or some hot-tempered man will attack you, and you and your family will lose your lives." So in other words, "Duh, we're stronger than you." If you don't just take your lumps and leave us, So how messed up is this, right? This is a Levite who's serving for a man with an idol, the worship of an idol, and then this tribe just comes and steals the idol as if the idol means, anyway, it's just a mess. Everything's a mess. So anyway, it says, verse 30, that the Danites actually, they took over the land of Laish. They call it Dan, and there the Danites set up for themselves the idols. And Jonathan, son of Gershom, that's where we learn his name, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. So anyway, they continued to use the idols Micah had made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So the house of God, the tabernacle, is here. Now they've made this place up here in this place called Dan, and they're worshiping the idols. So in 19 it explains, in those days Israel had no king. So now we learn the saddest story of all is this final one. And this Levite who had a concubine in Bethlehem down here, he had her as his concubine, but it says in verse 2 she was unfaithful to him. We don't know if she was actually unfaithful or if she just decided she didn't want to live with him and went back to be with her dad. So she went back to live with her dad in Bethlehem. Well, he goes back to get her, and the father-in-law is happy to see her and entertains him for 3 days. On the 4th day, he plans to leave, verse 5. But the father talks him into staying. "Oh, stay another day." Verse 8, on the morning of the 5th day when he rose to go, the girl's father said, "Refresh yourself, wait till the afternoon." And then he tries to get him to spend the night. So you don't know if all of this detail is just to help us see. I mean, maybe it would have been different if he'd left on a different day, or if he'd left in the morning instead of finally on the 5th day when the father has made them stay through the morning and into the afternoon. He tries to say, "Hey, why don't you just stay the night?" But he says, "No, we've stayed too long, we gotta go." So he gets up and he leaves with his concubine, and they come to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is still, the Jebusites still own Jerusalem. So he says, "No, I don't want to stop there because it's foreigners, but let's go up to Gibeah over here. Let's go up to Gibeah and stop where we know there are Israelites." So he goes up to Gibeah, which is in the tribe of Benjamin, and he stops in Gibeah, and nobody will take them in. And when nobody takes them in, finally this older man comes back from work and he says, "Oh, don't stay in the, what is this reminding you?" This is very similar to another story we read.
Lot.
What is it? Lot in Genesis 19. So he invites him in, and what happens when he invites him in? The men of the city come, right? And Verse 22 of chapter 19, while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." So very much reminiscent of Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, reminiscent of that, what did they offer? It's just horrifying.
Virgin daughter.
He says, "No, don't do this to the man. Take my virgin daughter or his concubine." And you're like, oh, this is so messed up. So anyway, it doesn't say that he ended up giving his daughter, but the man did give him his concubine. And the way he says it too, in verse 24, "Look, here's my virgin daughter and his concubine. I'll bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish." You're just like, oh, it just makes you sick in the pit of your stomach. But the man would not listen to him, so the man took his concubine and sent her outside. I just can't even imagine all this. They rape her and abuse her throughout the night. At dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman comes back to the house. She's crawling back to the house where her master was staying. She fell down at the door, lay there until daylight. And then when her master got up in the morning, verse 27, and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, you're like, wouldn't your first thought be, I want to find my, concubine? Anyway, he sees there lay his concubine fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold, and he says to her, "Get up, let's go." And I'm just like, oh, this whole thing is just awful. So there's no answer, so he puts her on his donkey, she's dead, takes her home. What does he do? He cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends it to the different tribes and says, "This awful thing just happened." Now, and I guess to their credit, the Israelites aren't so far gone that they don't recognize that this is a very wrong thing that has happened. So to their credit, the Israelites all come together and they say, "We need to take care of this. This is a bridge too far." Now, don't you look at our culture sometimes and go, where's the line, right, that you have finally crossed and it's too far? Well, here the Israelites who had been doing all this idol worship and sexual immorality, they said, this is a bridge too far. We cannot let this happen in Israel. So they all gather together. They come up against the Benjamites, and all they say, they come up against Gibeah, and they say, "Just send out the men who did this terrible thing, and we'll just deal with those men." But the Benjamites won't agree to that. Instead, they hunker down. They get all their warriors. They had 22,000 fighting men in Benjamin. They gather them all together there in Gibeah, and they go up against all the Israelites that have gathered. And at first, the Benjamites are such good swordsmen that at first the Benjamites succeed. They cut down, it says in verse 21 of chapter 20, they cut down 22,000, and the first battle, the next day they come out and they cut down 18,000 Israelites. So the Israelites have already lost like 40,000 men in this battle, and they're like, "Lord, what do you want us to do here? Should we still continue this?" And the Lord said, "Yes, I'll give you success tomorrow." So they set an ambush, and it's exactly like Joshua 8. They do exactly the same thing as Joshua did when he went up against Ai. They attack from the front. The Benjaminites, who had defeated them twice, come out to attack them, but they'd staged people to come up through the back. So they came up through the back, they took the city, they were able to defeat the Benjamites, and the fighting was so heavy in verse 34, at the end, the fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day, the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjamites, all armed with swords. So they defeated the Benjamites, and then after they've had this defeat over Benjamin, what do they realize? They mourn, because what do they realize that they have done? They've destroyed almost a whole tribe of Israel. There's only 600 Benjamite men left. They've destroyed almost a whole tribe of Israel. And they begin weeping and saying, "Oh, we're going to only have 11 tribes. This is not a good thing." But they'd also taken an oath when they came together that not one of us, chapter 21, we took an oath that not one of us will give his daughter to marriage to a Benjamite. So we have 600 men, but they have no women. How are we going to keep this tribe going? when we've all sworn that we won't give our women to a Benjamite because of this evil thing that they did. Now what's going to happen? So the first thing they come up with a two-pronged plan. The first one was, they said, who didn't come up to help us when we went up against, when we sent out to all the Israelites and they said, you've got to come help us settle this matter with the Benjamites. And they realized that nobody had come from over here, Jabesh Gilead, over here. So they said, okay, because they didn't send anybody to help us, we're going to go and destroy the Jabesh Gilead. But we'll save any of the virgin women we're going to save. So they kill everybody in the town except for 400 virgin women that they find in the town, and they give these 400 virgin women to these 600 Benjamites. But what's the problem?
Killing out another.
Well, yes, they've killed off another section of Israel, right? Another town in Israel, but there's still 200 men who don't have wives. And they've made a vow that they won't give their daughters to wives. And I honestly think that this is in the 7 Wives for 7 Brothers. Do you remember that? I think I don't know if I'm recalling it right. I think they're reading this passage of scripture when they come up with their plan. Because what they say is, okay, we can't give our women to them, but what we do is we have this festival where everybody's going to come to the festival, and they tell the Benjamites, they said, just come in during the festival and take 200 women. And then we're not giving them to you, right? It's messed up. All those judges, it's just, you think, how messed up can people get? Well, I'm telling you, we're watching it in our country, aren't we? When you deny God, when you deny the God who made you, and you deny everything he's telling you is right and good and true, and you choose to do things your own way, it gets messed up. That's just the way it happens. So we're seeing how messed up it gets. So anyway, they steal 200 women, and the Israelites said, well, we forgive you because we kind of arranged for that, right? But now, yay, now we have like this 600 men who can, now we can not lose the tribe of Benjamin. But it took Benjamin, remember how many thousands? Like, I think the smallest tribe had 20,000 fighting men, right? They lost 25,000 men in that battle, 25,100 men. So now in this tribe of Benjamin, there are only 600 men. And the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is that next week we're going to learn about the first king of Israel. Does anybody know the first king of Israel? Saul. And guess where he's from? He's from the tribe of Benjamin. And so when he says, I am from the least tribe, when they try and anoint him king, he wasn't kidding. He was from the least tribe, because coming out of Judges, the Benjamites were a very small tribe at that time. And the first act, I just wanted to give you this so that when you're reading it'll come to light for you. Their first act, his first act as king, is to come to the rescue of a town called Jabesh Gilead. Well, think about it. Where did they get the wives for the Benjamites? From Jabesh Gilead. So undoubtedly, he's coming to the rescue of, relatives or people who are close to him, right? Because it's the people of Jabesh Gilead that end up marrying. It's the women from Jabesh Gilead that end up marrying. So his first act as king is to go to the defense of the people of Jabesh Gilead. So all that to say, it's interesting when you start putting these things together and you see that. And then the final sentence of Judges just says it all. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. Yes, this is a very sad. But I think it's very sad, but I think it's a lesson. Of course, some people think, well, if it's in the Bible, God's telling us this is good. But is God telling us what happens in Judges is good? No. What is God telling us from the book of Judges? Yes, he's saying learn from that, right? And understand, don't get confused about cause and effect. Why did they keep being oppressed by these people? Why did that keep happening to them? Was it because God was no longer strong enough to help them? It was because what were they doing?
They kept falling into sin.
They kept falling into sin, worshiping idols, and all this sexual sin. You just see they got just really confused and in this very, very dark place. In the midst of that, we'll have to take a look at it next week when we come together. But there's this one bright spot of Ruth, which is just such a beautiful bright spot. And that happens in the midst of this terrible, dark time of the judges. And again, I think it's a lesson to us that even though God judges nations who are doing wrong and awful things, he also always sees individuals. So just like he had seen Rahab in Jericho, and he rescued this Gentile prostitute who comes into the line of Jesus, so now in Ruth we see he's rescuing this Moabitess who is ready to help her mother-in-law and to worship the God of Israel. And we watch God do a very beautiful thing in that. So we'll touch on that when we start next week. And now we're going to go into, don't forget to read your 30 days, because now we're going into the kingdom era. And the kingdom era, like we've gone through 2 eras in 2 weeks, we will be in the kingdom era 4 months, because most of the Old Testament focuses on the kingdom era. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are all in the kingdom era. Almost all of the poetry is from the kingdom era, and almost all of the prophets are from the kingdom era. So we're going to learn, there's a lot of time that we will spend in the kingdom era. So don't forget to read the 30 days so that you have the big picture understanding of what we're going into with the kingdom era, okay? Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, these are sad stories that we read today, and they're true stories, and I believe that you recorded them so that we would learn from them. And Father, just like the Israelites, sometimes we get our eyes off of you, and we think that somehow we know better, that we can live our lives without you, that we can live our lives doing things our own way. And Father, that just never works out well. You made us, you've told us how we were meant to live, and when we don't listen to you, it always leads to disaster. So Father, I just pray that we would learn from this. Father, that we would love you with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, that our hearts would be willing to listen to you and to respond to the truth you reveal in your word. And then, Father, that we would obey you, that we would serve you with all that we are, that we would be lights in this dark time of our own country, that we would be like lights that shine brightly to those around us. So, Father, use us this week, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.